Okay, so we had just finished writing the journal in 11 lit. If you will turn in your book, you have questions from the other day. Anybody want to share anything about that? I'll eventually look at them, but we're on page 67. It only has 13 chapters in it. Guys, if you're finished, you can put the computers away. We're reading the chapter entitled "Where I Lived, What I Lived For." You should again have a question. Yeah, go All right, so let's focus on this, fellas, in the back. Yeah, when they get back. We've got two people out there. Page 67. In this chapter, he talks about why he ended up on Walden Pond and about that. So I'm going to start, and I'm going to ask you to help me. Yeah.
Which number, like, are we on?
2. We answered 1.
You said 76. Okay.
Yeah. No, 67.
Oh, 67.
Are everybody ready for us here? All right. Yeah.
Do you have an extra sheet of the questions?
Yeah, I got them right here. I know, guys, you're also tired. We try to keep the mask as high as you can. I get tired out of it. All right, everybody with us? Really only about 15 minutes, so let's try to make it a good one. My imagination, this is bottom of the page, carried me so far. He was talking about earlier about just the idea that we all do. We imagine owning something before we ever really own it. You know, we see a land, that'd be great for a house. What our house look like? We look at a house because you've never done that, but you will someday, and you can imagine living in it. If you can imagine it, it might be one that you buy. If you can't imagine it, then you ignore it. So he's talking about this, trying to find a place to live. He said, my imagination carried me so far that I even had the refusal of several farms. The refusal was all I wanted. But I never got my fingers burned in actual possession. The nearest that I came to actual possession was when I bought the Hollowell place. I had begun to sort my seeds and collected materials with which to make a wheelbarrow to carry it on or off with. But before the owner gave me the deed of it, his wife, every man has such a wife, changed her mind and wished to keep it. And he offered me $10 to release him. Now, to speak the truth, I had but 10 cents in the world, and it surpassed my arithmetic to tell if I was that man who had 10 cents or had a farm or $10 or all together. However, I let him keep the $10 and the farm too, for I had carried it far enough. Or rather, to be generous, I sold him the farm for just what I gave for it. And as he was not a rich man, made him a present of $10, and still had my 10 cents, the seeds, and materials for a wheelbarrow left. I found thus that I had been a rich man without any damage to my property, but I retained the landscape, and I have since annually carried off what it yielded without a wheelbarrow. With respect to landscapes, I am monarch of all I survey. My right there is none to dispute. So I actually had an agreement, no money had exchanged hands, to buy a farm. And the man's wife changed her mind, she didn't want to move. So he said, to get out of the agreement, no money had changed hands. To get out of the agreement, he offered him $10. And he didn't take it because he had not paid any money for it. No money had exchanged hands, so he let him keep the money, and he didn't buy that.
I think my book is in my locker. Can I go get it?
Can you borrow one? There's one over there. I think there's probably one right over there.
We're reading Walden.
All right. So why don't we start with Alistair?
So
Read a couple of these.
I have frequently.
Yeah, read a couple of these.
This one and the next one.
Yeah.
This one and the next one. Okay. I've frequently seen a poet withdraw, having enjoyed the most valuable part of the farm, while the crystal farmer supposed that he had got a few wild apples only. Why the owner does not know if for many years when a poet has put his farm in rhyme, most admirable kind of physical fence, has fairly pounded it, filled it, skimmed it, and got all the cream, and left retirement being about two miles from the village, half a mile from the nearest neighbor, and separated from the highway by a broad field. It's bounding on the river, which the owner said protected by its fogs from frost in the spring, though that was nothing to me. The great color and ruinous state of the house and barn, and dilapidated fences, which put such an interval between me and the last occupant, a hollow and lightly covered apple trees gnawed by rabbits, showing what kind of neighbors I should have. But above all, the recollection I had of it from my earliest voyages up the river. The house was concealed behind a dense grove of red maples, through which I heard the house dog bark. I was in haste to buy it before the proprietor finished up getting out some rocks, cutting down the hollow apple trees, and growing up some of the young birches which had sprung up in the pasture, when Short had made any more of his improvements. To enjoy these advantages, I was ready to carry it on, like alas, to take the world
Atlas.
Atlas. To take the world on my shoulders. I never heard what compensation he received for that, and do all those things which have no other motive or excuse, but that I may pay for it and be unmolested in my possession of it. For I knew all the while that it would yield the most abundant crop of the kind I wanted, if I could only afford to let it alone. But it turned out as I have said.
So we've answered 2. We haven't answered 3. He said he didn't buy the farm, and you need to understand the conditions. Then he said, I retained the landscape. Yeah.
Ben and I don't have the questions.
I got them right here. You're welcome to come again.
I think I'll talk about the strategy.
All right, so what does he mean, I retained the landscape? He didn't buy it. He almost bought it. He would have bought it, but they got out of it, reneged on it. What does he mean, he retained the landscape? Right. He can't erase his memory of it, so it's like he owned it in his mind. So we'll go to, Tucker. Yeah, just put it right there. We're on page 68.
All right. All that I can say?
I'm sorry, 69, yeah. Read 2 of it.
All that I can say then, with respect to farming on a large scale, I've always portrayed it correct, was that I had the seeds ready. Anything that seeds improve with age, I have no doubt that time discriminates between the good and the bad. And when it lasts, I shall plant. I shall be less likely to be disappointed. So I would say to my fellows, once for all, as long as possible, live free and uncommitted. It makes but little difference whether you are committed to a farm or the county jail. Old Cato, whose De Re Rustica is my cultivator, says, and the only translation I have seen makes sheer nonsense of that passage. When you think of getting a farm, turn and press in your mind not to buy greedily, or spare your pains to look at it, and do not think it enough to go round it once. The oftener you go there, the more it will please you, if it is good. I think I shall not buy greedily, but go round and round it as long as I live, and be buried in it first, that it may please me the more that lasts.
Thanks. Would you read the next 2?
The present was my next experiment of this kind, which I propose to describe more at length, for convenience putting the experience of 2 years into one. As I've said, I do not propose to write an ode to conjecture, but to brag as lusciously as Chanticleer in the mornings standing on his roost, and if only to wake neighbors. When I first looked up to the abode in the woods, that is, began to spend my nights as well as days there, which by accident was on Independence Day for the 4th of July, 1845.
I don't know if I'd ask you that here, but I want you to know that date. July 4th, hard to forget that, 1845 is when he started living on Walden Pond. And he'll explain at some point how that happened. But he lived there 2 years and 2 months. And Walden Pond is only a mile or 2 outside of the city of Concord, the town. It wasn't a city. That's where he grew up. So it's not like he lived in some desert island somewhere or some remote section of the mountains. He was literally only a mile or so from town, and he went several times a week. So this wasn't about survival. It was about survival in a different way. It wasn't about just physically surviving harsh conditions. It was trying to make the conditions as simple as possible, just to see what does it take to live, and then spend the rest of your time doing what he believes man should be doing, contemplating things, and there are other things he said. Anyway, those is just one of the facts you need to remember. July 4th, 1845.
1845. My house was not finished for winter, but was merely a defense against the rain, without plastering or chimney walls, being of rough weather, stained boards with wide chinks, which made it cool at night. The upright white hewn studs and freshly cleaned door and window casings gave it a clean and airy look, especially in the morning, when its timber were saturated with dew, so that I gauged that by noon some sweet dawn would exude from them. To my imagination, it retained throughout the day more or less of this
Auroral.
auroral character, reminding me of a certain house on a mountain which I had visited the year before. This was an airy and unplastered cabin fit to entertain a traveling god, and where a goddess might trail her garments. Her winds, which passed over the dwelling, were such as sweep over the ridges of mountains, bearing the broken strings or celestial parts, only of terrestrial music. The morning, when forever glows, the poem of creation is uninterrupted, but few are the ears that hear it. Olympus is but the outside of the earth everywhere.
All right, when we go to Sal.
The only house I have been the owner of before, if I accept the boat as a tent, which I used occasionally when making excursions in the summer. And this is still rolled up in my garret, but the boat, after passing from hand to hand, has gone down the stream of time. With this more substantial shelter about me, I had made some progress towards settling in the world. This frame, so lightly clad, was a sort of crystallization around me, and reacted on the builder. It was suggestive somewhat as a picture in outline. I did not need to go outdoors to take the air, for the atmosphere within had lost none of its freshness. It was not so much within doors as behind the door where I sat, even in the rainiest weather. The Haravansa says, an abode without birds is like a meat without seasoning. Such was not my abode, for I found myself suddenly neighbor to the birds, not by having imprisoned one, but by having caged myself near them. I was not only near to some of those which commonly frequent the garden and the orchard, but to those wilder and more thrilling songsters of the forest which never or rarely serenade a villager. The wood thrush, the veery, the scarlet tanager, the field sparrow, the whippoorwill, and many others.
I get the feeling, we skipped the part when he actually built his house. What he did was he bought a house, if you want to call, we'd call it a shed, really. I mean, not much bigger than that. But he bought that and then carried the pieces of that house to this location, which happened to be land owned by Ralph Waldo Emerson, his mentor. And so he built the house there. And I get the feeling that it even says it's not well insulated. Now, he spent 2 years, including winters. So I don't know how he managed in Massachusetts to survive a winter with basically holes in the walls. I mean, the walls they didn't have insulation. It wasn't even, you could see through the wall in some places because the boards weren't even. And that was his choice. You know, people could do that. He chose not to. But that's why he says being outdoors is a lot like being indoors, a lot being outdoors. Why don't you read for us?
All right, is it the present?
I was seated by the shore of a small pond.
I was seated by the shore of a small pond about a mile and a half south of the village of Concord. Concord and somewhat higher than it in the midst of an extensive wood between the town and Lincoln, and about 2 miles south of that, our only field known to fame, Concord Battleground. But I was so low in the woods that the opposite shore, half a mile off like the rest, covered with wood, was my most distant horizon. For the first week, whenever I looked out on the pond, it impressed me like a tarn high up on the side of a mountain, its bottom far above the surface of other lakes. And as the sun arose, I saw it throwing off its nightly clothing of mists, and here and there, by degrees, its soft ripples or its smooth reflecting surface was revealed, while the mists, like ghosts, were stealthily withdrawing in every direction into the woods, as at the breaking up of some nocturnal conventicle. The very dew seemed to hang upon the trees later into the day than usual, as on the sides of mountains.
Would you keep reading, Sarah? We'll probably all we have time for.
The small lake was of most value as a neighbor in the intervals of a gentle rainstorm in August, when both air and water being perfectly still, but the sky overcast. Mid-afternoon had all the serenity of evening, and the wood thrush sang around, and it was heard from shore to shore. A lake like this was never smoother than at such time, and the clear portion of the air above it like shallow ribbon by clouds. The water full of light and reflection, and the lower heavens itself so much the more important. From a hilltop nearby, where the woods have been recently cut off, there was a pleasing vista southward across the pond. Through a wide indentation in the hills which form the shore there, where their opposite sides sloping toward each other suggested a stream flowing out in the direction through a wooded valley. But streams there was none, that I looked between and over the near green hills to some distance, and higher ones in the horizon, tinged with blue. Indeed, by standing on tiptoe, I could catch a glimpse of some of the peaks of the still bluer and more distant mountain ranges in the northwest. Those true blue coins from the heavens on it, and also some portion of a village. But in their other directions, even from this point, I could not see over or beyond the woods which surround me. It is well to have some water in your neighborhood to give buoyancy and to float the earth. One value, even of the smallest well, is that when you look into it, you see the earth is not content, but insular. This is as important as that keeps butter cool. When I look across the pond from this peak toward the Sudbury meadows, which in time of flood I distinguish elevated perhaps by a mirage in their seething valleys. At the plains and the basin, all the earth beyond the pond appears like a thin crust, insulated and floated even by this small sheet of intervening water. And I was reminded that this on which I dwelt was but direct.
That's 170 years ago. If you went to Concord, Massachusetts, they have preserved Walden Pond. The pond's still there. I think it's probably surrounded by apartments and office buildings, but they managed to keep part of that free. This is what it looked like 170 years ago. All right, we do have a quiz Thursday. That vocabulary quiz is Thursday. Let's wait for the announcement, guys. I'm not going anywhere. Yeah.
Do we have? Oh wait, do we have? Oh yeah. When's our Walden?
Well, when you finish.